There was a time when the Earth was not home to cities, empires, or even villages or roads. It was a primitive, wild, and profoundly indifferent world to human existence. 300,000 years ago, our ancestors walked on a hostile planet governed by uncontrollable forces of nature, imposing creatures and relentless climates. Survival was not a choice, but a daily urgency that demanded every ounce of ingenuity, resilience, and adaptation. This is a journey into that deep past, where humans were not yet masters of fire, nor architects of durable shelters, a time when every night could be the last. Before you embark on this journey to the heart of prehistory, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share in the comments what you think was the most difficult thing for humans of that era: the cold, the predators, or the absolute loneliness of the world. There are no books written by human hands from 300,000 years ago to tell us what it was really like to live then. But the bones buried under layers of sediment, the rudimentary stone tools, the fossilized footprints, and the remains of ancient camps speak to us with a voice as old as history itself. Science has made it possible to reconstruct part of this forgotten landscape, and what we discover is both terrifying and fascinating. Our ancestors did not live in one place. They were eternal nomads, walkers, constantly moving in search of water, food, and shelter. Africa was then the epicenter of human life. The first Homo sapiens were beginning to distinguish themselves from other human species like Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus. They were not the only ones, but they showed signs of an emerging intelligence that would set them apart over time. The ability to make more sophisticated tools, rudimentary organization in groups, and a growing symbiotic relationship with their environment. The days were dictated by the sun and the seasons. Hunting required stealth, cooperation, and courage. There were no long-range weapons or complex traps, only precisely carved spears, sharp stones, and the will not to starve. The prey were animals we can barely imagine today: ancient elephants, woolly rhinoceroses, wild bison. Hunting one of them meant food for days, but also the risk of instant death if something went wrong. The nights, however, were even more dangerous. When fire was not a certainty, but an uncertain miracle, humans feared the darkness. It was not a matter of psychological fear, but a tangible threat. Nocturnal felines, giant hyenas, ancestral wolves roamed near the camps, guided by the smell of fresh meat. The only defense was the group, sleeping together, taking turns to watch, protecting the weakest. Communication was limited, but not non-existent. Through gestures, guttural sounds, and facial expressions, humans managed to coordinate actions, warn of dangers, or plan a hunt. They did not speak like us, but their need for connection was as real as ours. Cooperation was from the beginning a survival strategy as vital as the use of tools. The relationship with nature was one of total dependence. There was no mastery of the environment. The human being was not a conqueror, but a fragile visitor. The climate could change suddenly. A prolonged drought forced the group to move hundreds of kilometers. A sudden storm could destroy a makeshift shelter. The concept of stability did not exist, only constant movement as the only certainty. The use of fire, although already known in some regions, was not yet controlled by everyone.
Lighting a flame could require a lot of time, technique, and ideal conditions. But once achieved, fire not only served for cooking, it was a source of heat, protection against wild animals, and a social gathering point. Around the flames, the first attempts at group cohesion were born, where, perhaps, the first symbols and ideas emerged, which would later become myths. In this context, children were cared for by everyone. The nuclear family, as we understand it today, did not exist. Groups functioned as collective units, where the survival of the youngest was the responsibility of many. The loss of a single member weakened the entire group, which is why every birth was a victory, and every death a deep wound that time rarely healed. But not everything was violence or fear. There were also moments of pause, contemplation, and learning. Observing the behavior of animals, understanding the cycles of the seasons, memorizing safe routes, discovering which plants were edible and which were poisonous. That knowledge was pure gold in times when a mistake could cost a life. Some archaeological remains show signs of rudimentary burials, which suggests a primitive form of respect for the dead. It was not religion as we understand it today, but it was an indication that our ancestors were beginning to see beyond the moment. Perhaps they sensed there was something more after life, or at least that death deserved an act of silence, a farewell. The skin of humans was exposed to the elements. There was no clothing as such, only animal skins rudimentarily worked to protect from the cold or cover the most sensitive parts. The hands, however, were the great tool. With them, stones were carved, meat was cut, and temporary shelters were built with branches and leaves. The human brain already showed signs of increasing complexity, and with it a greater capacity to anticipate, remember, and learn. And in the midst of that brutal routine of hunting, gathering, displacement, and constant dangers, something was brewing that would forever change the history of the world. Consciousness, not only of oneself, but of the other, of the group, of time, of space. The human being was beginning to understand that surviving was not enough, that there was something more, something that could not be hunted or cooked, but that began to beat in the depths of each night, between the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the prehistoric wind. As human consciousness awakened in the midst of a hostile world, so too did the need to preserve memory. There was no writing or numbers, but the human mind began to register patterns. The passing of the seasons, the behaviors of animals, the location of certain caves or water sources. These memories were not stored in books, but in the spoken word, in oral repetition, and perhaps
First, symbols engraved on stone or wood. Culture in its most elemental form was being born. The human groups that inhabited different regions of Africa and then began their slow expansion into Eurasia faced a changing geography. In some places, dense forests offered refuge but hid invisible predators. In others, the open plains facilitated visibility, but also exposed humans to being hunted by faster and stronger beasts. The environment dictated the rules, and humans learned through trial and error how to obey them to survive. During this time, hunter-gatherers developed an almost instinctive knowledge of the natural environment. They knew how to read the tracks on the ground, interpret the flight of birds, and identify subtle signs in the clouds or in the behavior of animals. This knowledge was not transmitted in schools, but in daily life, in constant observation.
The apprentice was not a child sitting in front of a teacher, but a youth who had to follow the elder in silence, watching carefully how a tool was carved or a trap was set with leaves and branches. Tools were an extension of the body. At first, stones sharpened by percussion served to cut meat or break bones. Later, more sophisticated hand axes appeared, as well as spearheads and scrapers. Each object required patience, technique, and an intuitive understanding of the material. Not just any stone would do, it had to have the right hardness and the correct shape. Humans began to select specific places to find these materials, creating access routes. Although they didn't know it yet, social organization remained small, based on clans or small family groups. Authority was not exercised by force, but by knowledge and experience. The elders were the living memory of the group, and although the prehistoric world was not kind to old age, those who managed to survive beyond their youth were respected for their wisdom. There were no rigid hierarchies, but there was recognition for those who knew more. Those who could find water in times of drought, those who could track animals, those who knew how to heal a wound. Falling ill was an uncertain sentence. There were no antibiotics or structured medicine. However, remains of medicinal plants have been found alongside ancient human skeletons, suggesting a rudimentary use of botanical knowledge. Some roots relieved pain, others helped reduce fever or stop minor infections. The ability to identify these resources and share that knowledge was vital for the group's survival. At certain archaeological sites, human remains have been discovered with fractures that, surprisingly, show signs of having healed. This implies that the group cared for that injured person, protected them, and provided them with food while they recovered. This behavior breaks with the idea of a purely violent and savage prehistory. There was also room for compassion, for a primitive empathy that would later become the basis of human societies. Migrations were inevitable. When resources were depleted, the group had to move. These migrations were not planned with maps or defined routes. They were based on instinct, the memory of the landscape, and sometimes desperation. Crossing unknown territories involved encounters with other human groups. Some were friendly, willing to trade or cooperate temporarily. Others were territorial and hostile. Conflicts could arise over access to water, hunting grounds, or the simple fear of the stranger. But there were also cultural exchanges. A more efficient tool could be copied, a hunting technique observed and replicated. In this way, knowledge was not only transmitted from generation to generation, but also between different groups. Although rudimentary, this network of connections wove the first threads of an interconnected humanity. Reproduction and the care of newborns required an environment of relative safety. There were no assisted births, and the risk of dying during childbirth was high,
both for the mother and the baby. Therefore, each new life was a momentous event. The entire group adapted to the presence of an infant, adjusting its pace of movement, protecting the most defenseless with a collective care that we might now call community instinct. Art had not yet fully flourished, but its first signs were beginning to sprout. Some objects found, apparently with no practical use, could have had symbolic value. Painted stones, carved bones, repeated marks on rock surfaces could have been the first attempts at representation, at telling without words what was lived, feared, or desired. Spirituality, though in an embryonic state, cannot be dismissed.
The human being, facing death repeatedly, surely wondered, even without words, about the meaning of existence. Some burials show signs of having been prepared with a certain care, the body placed in a specific position, perhaps accompanied by objects. This could indicate a form of ritual, a first attempt to give meaning to the end of life, a spark that would later become religion. The fire, when present, became the heart of the camp. Around it, they not only cooked, but also transmitted knowledge, planned expeditions, and strengthened bonds. Dance, guttural songs, cries, and silences charged with emotion were part of that nocturnal communion that united the group. Although history did not record them with ink, those moments were the seed of oral culture, of myths, of narrative thought. And as the world changed slowly, with glaciers advancing in the north and jungles expanding in the south, the human being continued forward. It was not the strongest, nor the fastest, but it was the most adaptive. It could improvise, learn from error, change strategy. That capacity, invisible at first glance, would be its greatest evolutionary advantage. Because in a world where everything could transform from one day to the next, surviving meant changing along with the environment. And that humans were already beginning to do. Over the millennia, human adaptability began to redefine the balance of power in the chain of life. What was once a constant struggle to avoid being hunted slowly transformed into the ability to become the dominant hunter. This transition did not happen abruptly, nor was it guaranteed. It was the result of countless generations observing, failing, and trying new ways to face the unpredictable. The human groups that mastered fire achieved something revolutionary. Not only could they cook their food, making it more digestible and safer, but they could also expand into colder regions where other species could not survive. The warmth, light, and protection of the fire allowed humans to inhabit caves and regions previously unthinkable. Around the flames, the first forms of communal life were organized, where the night was not synonymous with helplessness, but with gathering and strategy. Hunting, for its part, evolved from an instinctive activity to a meticulous art. It was not enough to run after an animal. It required studying its patterns, knowing the paths it used, understanding its behavior. Some groups developed collective hunting techniques, surrounding prey or guiding them towards traps. Cooperation became fundamental. Those who hunted together and shared resources ensured not only their sustenance, but also their permanence in the group. From these habits, specific roles emerged. Some were more skilled at carving tools, others at detecting tracks. Some excelled in gathering plants or caring for the young. This rudimentary division of labor laid the groundwork for more complex forms of social organization. Although survival was still the priority, the bonds between group members began to strengthen around complementary functions. Over time, certain regions began to show more stable concentrations of population. This does not yet mean settlements, but key points on migratory routes. Caves with access to water, shelters protected from the weather, areas rich in game. In these places, relationships between different groups developed. Exchange, although limited, became increasingly important. Tools for skins, fire for information, techniques for food. Cooperation, even between different groups, offered greater chances of survival. Communication, though still without a structured language as we know it, evolved. Gestures, guttural sounds, signs drawn in the soil or carved on rock constituted a complex.
The landscapes also changed. Some human groups faced the advance of glaciers, which forced them to move. Others lived with dense jungles where the danger came not from the cold, but from humidity, insects, and silent beasts. In all cases, the ability to read the environment and adapt tools and strategies to each climate was decisive. The diet was diverse and depended on the location. In forest areas, fruits, roots, and small animals constituted the basic diet. On the plains, the meat of large mammals was coveted, though difficult to obtain. In some cases, humans became opportunistic scavengers, waiting for other predators to finish their feast before approaching. This risky and humiliating practice was part of the reality for many groups for long periods. Conflicts with other species were constant. Cave lions, saber-toothed tigers, giant hyenas. The human being was not the only one with hunger or strategies. Sometimes confrontations were inevitable and the outcome uncertain. Sometimes humans won. Other times they were eliminated. Prehistory was also a history of losses, of lineages that did not survive, of paths extinguished before leaving a trace. Each fossil found today is just a fragment of that great puzzle. However, there were also moments of unexpected ingenuity. Some groups began to use traps with hidden ditches or pushed animals towards cliffs to obtain meat without direct combat. These methods required not only strength, but also planning, teamwork, and an increasingly refined understanding of animal behavior. It was intelligent hunting, the product of centuries of observation and collective learning. With the development of these practices came an important change. Time was no longer lived only in the immediate present. Human groups began to think about tomorrow, preserving meat, saving seeds, making tools in advance. This ability to anticipate, to imagine the future, even if it was just the next day, is one of the clearest signs of symbolic thought. For the first time, humans acted not only to survive now, but to survive later. Women, far from occupying a passive role, were protagonists in these societies. Many were expert gatherers, knowledgeable about medicinal plants, and responsible for the transmission of knowledge. They also participated in hunting, food processing, and the care of tools. The division of labor did not yet follow rigid gender patterns, but was based on skills, age, and the specific needs of the group. Death was a constant, and with it fear, but also respect. Some remains found show signs of having been buried with care, even with flowers or nearby objects. Although we cannot know their meaning for certain, it is possible that these acts were early expressions of grief, memory, or even a vague notion of transcendence. Life did not end with the body, at least not for those left behind. The seasons marked harsh cycles. Winter brought scarcity, diseases, extreme cold. Summer brought drought and exposure. Each season forced the group to change, to adapt. Natural calendars were developed, not written, but memorized. When certain animals migrated, when fruits sprouted, when it was safe to cross a river. This accumulated wisdom, maintained by oral tradition, was one of the group's most valuable treasures. Despite everything, humanity persisted. The tracks they left in caves, the abandoned tools, the bones found centuries later, speak of a silent but determined struggle. There was no certainty of success, and yet they continued. Hunger, disease, exile, everything could destroy them. But something in them, a spark, an inextinguishable impulse, pushed them ever forward.
And it was that impulse that, little by little, began to sketch what would one day be civilization. The appearance of symbolic thought marked a definitive boundary between pure instinct and expanding consciousness. It was as if, in the midst of natural chaos, a new tool emerged, as powerful as fire or the spear: imagination. In various regions, almost at the same time, signs began to appear that humans were no longer just acting to survive, but also to represent the world. On the walls of caves, hands impregnated with red, yellow, and black pigment left their mark.
Scenes of hunting, mythical animals, human figures with altered proportions, symbols repeated over and over. These expressions were not simple decorations. They were attempts to codify the environment, to tell stories, to invoke something beyond the visible. The invisible was beginning to form part of the human experience. The pigments were extracted from minerals, plants, and charcoal, mixed with animal fat or saliva. The paintings were not improvised. They were carefully executed works, probably under rituals. Some caves are located in hard-to-reach places, suggesting a ceremonial purpose. Those dark, silent, and damp places were transformed into primitive temples, where art was also magic, and where each stroke could be a prayer, an invocation, a warning. Meanwhile, lithic technology continued to develop. Tools became more refined, axes were carved with greater symmetry, spearheads were sharper, and the first signs of the use of bone and ivory to make utensils began to appear. Some groups even began to drill small beads for pendants, probably used as amulets or signs of belonging. Aesthetics and utility began to mix. Social organization became more complex. It was no longer just about surviving, but about protecting a legacy. Groups were formed around leaders, not necessarily for their physical strength, but for their knowledge of the environment, their ability to foresee storms, to read tracks, to remember stories of the past. One could say that the first sages emerged, the ancestors of the shamans, the guardians of collective memory. With the stabilization of the climate after the end of the last great glaciation about 12,000 years ago, many groups began to experiment with a radical change: to stop moving. Sedentism did not happen overnight. It was a slow process, driven by the observation of nature. Seeds that fell near camps germinated. Some animals, like wild goats or wild boars, could be kept nearby. What was an opportunity became an experiment. What was an experiment became an irreversible change. Thus, agriculture was born. Cultivating meant taking on different risks. The land might not bear fruit. Pests could destroy the sprouts. The unpredictable climate could ruin months of work. But it also offered an advantage never before known: surplus. For the first time in its history, humanity had more than it needed for that day. And with that, the concept of property, of accumulation, of inequality was born. Where before everyone shared because there was no choice, now some began to store. The granaries, the jars full of grain, the corrals were signs of power. The one who had more could exchange, negotiate, control. This not only transformed the subsistence economy, but also human relationships. Hierarchies, dominant clans, and internal conflicts arose. However, the first villages were also born, with houses of mud, wood, and stone, organized around water sources. The community went from being mobile to being anchored.
Fixed roles developed: farmers, shepherds, weavers, builders. Children grew up in the same place where they were born. The elderly died surrounded by their own. Time became cyclical: sow, wait, harvest, give thanks. Agricultural rituals became essential: dances, songs, offerings. They sought to please the invisible forces that decided the success or failure of the harvest. The divine was integrated into daily life. The heavens were observed carefully: the lunar cycles, the positions of the sun, the rains. Everything was interpreted as signs. Thus began rudimentary astronomy. In certain places, like the Fertile Crescent, a region that includes parts of present-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey, this process intensified. Cereals like wheat and barley, and animals like sheep and oxen were domesticated. Permanent settlements like Çatalhöyük emerged, with interconnected houses without streets, where inhabitants walked on the roofs. In these communities, the first altars, fertility figurines, and ritual burials were found. Life and death intertwined in an increasingly symbolic dance. The construction of the first monumental structures also began. Places like Göbekli Tepe, with enormous stone pillars carved with animal figures, precede even the invention of writing or the wheel. What motivated these societies to mobilize so many resources to build temples? What worldview drove them? We still do not know for sure, but everything indicates that the spiritual, the social, and the everyday could no longer be separated. As villages grew,
So did conflicts. Disputes over fertile land, access to water, or stolen livestock became common. Human groups learned to defend themselves, to build walls, to organize guards. Warriors emerged, and with them, the first forms of organized violence. War, born as a response to scarcity and competition, became another part of human history. But not all was conflict. There were also advances in primitive medicine based on ancestral knowledge of plants. Some individuals began to be recognized as healers. Wounds were treated with mud, honey, or resin. Infusions were used to soothe pain. Cranial trepanations were practiced, as shown by remains found in different parts of the world, for purposes still debated. Science, still shrouded in mysticism, was beginning to make its way. With these transformations, the human being was no longer the same one who had roamed the African savannas 300,000 years earlier. Now he was a builder of worlds, a domesticator of nature, a narrator of myths. His achievements were immense, but so were his contradictions. Where there was cooperation, there was also control. Where there was ritual, there was also domination. Prehistory was approaching its end, but the challenges were just beginning. The language that was once barely a guttural echo in the throat of an ancestor had now become a complex tool, not only for naming things, but for explaining the inexplicable, for transmitting dreams, warnings, hopes. Words wove history, created the group's identity, guided decisions. Oral tradition became the bridge between generations, and it was that language that would one day write the first words on stone. The words sculpted in stone were not the beginning of history, but the culmination of a millennial process. Before hieroglyphics, before clay tablets and scrolls, human memory had been an oral river that flowed through generations. The stories told by the fire were the school, the temple, and the law. But with writing, something changed forever. History ceased to depend on memory. Thought began to be fixed, to accumulate, to evolve beyond time. As villages expanded, they transformed into towns, and then into the first proto-cities. Needs grew. It was necessary to manage harvests, register births, measure land, calculate the passage of time, organize tributes. Thus, the first notation systems were born. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians used cuneiform writing.
In Egypt, hieroglyphics adorned temples and tombs. Humanity was entering a new era, but the footprints of prehistory were still alive beneath the surface. At this point, humans had domesticated not only animals, but also their environment. Rivers were diverted, fields were sown with mathematical precision, roads were traced for trade. The exchange of goods between distant communities revealed a level of organization unthinkable centuries before. Barter gave way to more complex primitive forms of economy. Power was no longer measured by brute force, but by the ability to manage, persuade, govern. And with power came myth. Ancient civilizations did not separate the divine from the natural. The sun was not a distant star, it was a god. The rain was not a climatic phenomenon, it was a blessing or a punishment. Lightning was a sign from the beyond. Mountains were the abodes of spirits. Every aspect of the environment had a soul, a purpose, a message. The first priests and priestesses were interpreters of the heavens. Their function was to maintain the balance between the visible and invisible worlds. These beliefs were not mere whims. They served to explain the inexplicable, to calm the fear of death, to justify social rules. Why are some born rich and others poor? Why does one tribe dominate another? Why must we obey the one who wears a crown or a mask? Myth was, in many ways, the first form of ideology. However, spirituality was not only an instrument of power. It also offered comfort, meaning, and belonging. Rites of passage, funeral rituals, agricultural festivals all contributed to strengthening collective identity. By burying their dead with objects, flowers, or food, the ancients took a step beyond survival. They showed compassion, hope, faith. But the history of humanity does not advance in a straight line. For every advance, there is a fall. For every discovery, a threat. As communities grew, so did conflicts. Wars were no longer simple skirmishes between clans. They were organized campaigns with armies, strategies, and specialized weapons. Bronze, a mixture of copper and tin, gave rise to stronger swords, more durable shields, and deadlier spears. The first fortresses were raised on hilltops, protected by imposing walls. Architecture ceased to be merely functional and became a symbol of power. Palaces, temples, monumental tombs. Every stone was a declaration of domination over the land and over others. Inequality became structural. Kings claimed to be descended from the gods. The law was inscribed in stone, immutable.
Absolute. However, even in the midst of oppression, creativity flourished. The first schools trained scribes, astronomers, doctors, and engineers. Science was born, wrapped in religion, but with its own logic. The stars were observed, eclipses were calculated, calendars were designed, irrigation channels were built with millimeter precision. Humanity was no longer a plaything of nature. It was beginning to understand its mechanisms. Even so, daily life remained difficult. Diseases, poverty, and strenuous work were commonplace. The majority lived on the margins of temples and palaces, in mud huts, working the fields from dawn till night. But even there, in the humblest of settings, an indestructible force persisted: community. Networks of help, collective celebrations, stories told by grandparents kept alive a flame that no tyranny could extinguish. The ancients knew that survival depended not only on individual strength, but on the invisible fabric that united people. Sharing, caring, remembering, through these actions they transmitted not only knowledge, but also humanity. That was the great heritage of prehistoric times. Not only the invention of tools or techniques, but the creation of bonds that gave meaning to existence. In America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Oceania, the processes were diverse, but they shared a deep pattern. In every corner of the planet, humans sought to adapt, prosper, and transcend. Some cultures reached surprising levels of sophistication. In present-day Peru, for example, the Caral civilization built temples and urban centers more than 5,000 years ago, without yet having known pottery. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Nok developed terracotta sculptures before other regions discovered iron. The diversity of paths does not negate the unity of the human impulse. From the first steps out of Africa to the settlements at the poles, everything reveals the same constant: the capacity to imagine, to transform, to resist. Even in the face of natural catastrophes, epidemics, or wars, humanity returned, rebuilt, reinvented itself, as if the memory of millions of years of struggle were engraved in its bones. And as the first empires rose and fell, as borders were drawn with blood, a question persisted in the depths of human consciousness: who are we? The answers were multiple: children of gods, guardians of order, masters of the earth. But none was enough. There was a void, a search, a restlessness. What had begun as an instinct for survival now became a need for meaning. The great religions would emerge centuries later, philosophies too, but the seeds were already planted in prehistory. The human being had transformed from prey to hunter, from nomad to farmer, from artisan to city builder, but had not yet discovered the deepest dimension of himself: full self-awareness, reflection on his place in the cosmos. And that moment, when we finally began to write about ourselves, not only to tell what we did, but to ask why we did it, would mark the end of prehistory and the beginning of another era, an era that, though separated by thousands of years, still resonates in each of us. Because in our doubts, in our fears, in our hopes, the echo of those who, 300,000 years ago, faced a wild world with nothing more than their hands, their ingenuity, and their faith in tomorrow, still beats. The echoes of the past do not die, they only transform. While civilizations emerged with their temples and armies, the descendants of those ancient nomads who had not fully embraced a sedentary life still subsisted on the margins. Groups that continued to hunt, gather, and wander through forests, steppes, and deserts. Although the world seemed to be leaning towards urbanization and the centralization of power, the diversity of ways of life persisted, reminding us that prehistory did not die out from one day to the next, but coexisted with history for a long time. To the north, the peoples of Europe continued their own paths of development. On the British Isles, for example, more than 4,000 years ago, an enigmatic circle of stones known as Stonehenge emerged. Its exact function is still a matter of debate, but its existence demonstrates a surprising sophistication in architecture, astronomy, and community organization. It was not a primitive society in the simple sense of the word. It was a different humanity, with knowledge, symbols, and aspirations that we are only now beginning to understand. On the other side of the ocean, in what we now call America, cultures like
The Olmecs flourished. The first great sculptors of the continent carved colossal heads in stone, some more than 2 meters high. How did they achieve this without metal tools or beasts of burden? That mystery continues to amaze archaeologists. But beyond the technical, what those giant heads express is something profoundly human: the desire to leave a mark, to say, "We were here."
The struggle for survival was no longer just against the elements or wild animals. Now it was also a battle against oblivion. Memory became a form of resistance, a vital necessity. That is why rituals, monuments, songs, and cave paintings were born. It was the way to perpetuate what was learned, not to start from scratch with each generation. What a community knew had to be transmitted like an invisible treasure. In Africa, the cradle of humanity, the legacy continued to vibrate with force. In regions like the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians had already begun to erect their pyramids, perfecting construction techniques that still amaze today. But in less documented areas of the continent, cultures that mastered the art of iron smelting also flourished, such as the Bantu peoples, who would begin their migrations to the south, bringing with them technologies, languages, crops, and worldviews. This process of expansion and adaptation was a universal constant. Human beings from their origins were not static. They were walkers by nature, drivers of massive migrations that altered ecosystems, landscapes, and cultures. Wherever they arrived, they left footprints. Sometimes the footprints were beneficial: irrigation, domestication, alliance. At other times, destructive: looting, slavery, war. But in all of them, there was learning. Over the centuries, that ability to learn, accumulate knowledge, and share it was what differentiated us from the rest of the species. We were not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most resistant, but we were the best at observing, adapting, anticipating, and above all, at imagining. Because even when food was scarce and the night seemed eternal, the human being imagined a better world, an abundant harvest, a tomorrow with less pain. That imagination was also the engine of invention. Thus were born the wheel, the plow, the sail, the calendar, the number, the written word. Each object, each tool was an extension of the human body, but also of its mind. Through these advances, little by little, the environment ceased to be a constant enemy. Wild animals were contained or domesticated. Plagues began to be understood, though not yet conquered. Deserts were crossed, mountains were climbed, rivers were navigated. The world ceased to be an absolute mystery, and slowly became a map. An incomplete, changing map, but with routes that could be followed. And with the maps, something new emerged: ambition. It was no longer enough to survive. Now some wanted to conquer, others to trade, some to expand their faith or their culture. Contacts between peoples increased, bringing with them riches and also diseases. Where there was once isolation, there was now intermingling. Technologies traveled, but so did conflicts. Civilizations clashed, influenced each other, destroyed each other. History accelerated, but the human essence remained intact. Daily life, however, was not measured in great wars or in the founding of empires. It was measured in the work of the fields, in the raising of children, in the search for water, in the preparation of bread. Each day was a silent epic. And in those simple acts, repeated for centuries, the foundation of everything we take for granted today was built. It is easy to forget that every current technology, from a lamp to a satellite, has its root in a spark lit by calloused hands next to a cave. That every modern structure, from a hospital to a university, is the heir of the first huts built with branches and mud. That every word we speak today is the grandchild of the first grunts turned into language. But perhaps the most amazing thing of all is not what we built outside of ourselves, but what we built inside. Morality, empathy, compassion, art. At what point did a human being, seeing a companion die, not only feel sadness, but the need for comfort?
At what point did they stop killing by instinct? and begin to reflect on good and evil? When did the act of forgiving, of sharing without expecting anything in return, first appear? These questions do not have a precise answer, but their traces are present in the oldest vestiges, in a tomb decorated with flowers, in a stone carved with abstract symbols, in a bone healed with dedication. Those minimal gestures are monuments to the humanity that was born long before written history, a humanity that made itself through love, fear, care, and loss. The more we study the past, the more we understand that the so-called prehistoric people were not wild or inferior beings. They were explorers, inventors, dreamers. They were like us, but in another time. And their achievements, often ignored, are the foundation upon which our civilization was built. As we approach the end of this journey through 300,000 years of hidden history, a certainty begins to emerge. The true story is not written only in books or locked in museums. It is alive in every human gesture, in every act of creation, in every step taken towards the unknown. And there is still much to discover. That impulse to discover, to advance towards the unexplored, was not exclusive to ancient civilizations. It was present long before maps, compasses, or cities existed. It was part of the instinct that guided our ancestors as they crossed icy mountain ranges, navigated turbulent rivers in rudimentary canoes, or faced territories dominated by wild beasts and unpredictable climates. The spirit of exploration is as old as humanity itself. Long before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic or Marco Polo described the wonders of the East, entire peoples had already undertaken immense journeys without knowing what they would find on the other side. The human migrations that populated the planet were acts of silent courage. Entire families left behind their known shelters to follow trails of food, water, or a more favorable climate. Some never returned, but others founded new homes, new cultures, new ways of life. The first to arrive in Australia more than 60,000 years ago had to cross the open sea in primitive boats. In the Americas, the ancient inhabitants challenged glaciers, mountain ranges, and deserts to reach every corner of the continent, from the icy lands of Alaska to the swamps of the Amazon or the plains of the Pampas. Each step was a test of resilience, adaptation, and faith. Because although today we speak of prehistory as something distant or foreign, in reality we are made of that same material. We carry in our DNA the memory of those ancestral decisions, that of the hunter who learned to observe the wind, that of the mother who taught her daughter to recognize edible plants, that of the elder who narrated legends to keep the group's identity alive. None of that has been lost, it has only been transformed. Legends, for example, were much more than stories to pass the time. They were a way of teaching without books. Through symbols, metaphors, and sacred figures, peoples transmitted knowledge about natural dangers, harvest cycles, social rules, and fundamental values. These oral stories were, in essence, the first libraries of humanity. Religion, for its part, was not simply a belief in gods, but a way of explaining the inexplicable. When thunder roared in the sky, or the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the ancients saw in these phenomena the will of superior forces. Over time, these ideas gave rise to complex rites, priesthoods, temples, and profound worldviews that shaped collective behavior. But even beyond religious or mythical structures, what brings us closest to our ancestors is their capacity for wonder, the contemplation of the starry sky, curiosity about the cycles of the moon, the intuition that everything in nature was connected.
In many ancient cultures, trees, animals, rivers, and stones were seen as beings with souls. They lived in an enchanted world where every element had a purpose and a spirit. This deep connection with nature was undoubtedly one of the greatest teachings of prehistory. The ancients knew they were not owners of the land, but part of it. They respected the cycles, did not hunt more than necessary, thanked the animal that offered its life, asked permission from the rivers before crossing them.
Not because they were superstitious, but because they understood intuitively what science confirms today. Everything is interrelated. Unfortunately, with the arrival of intensive agriculture and private property, that vision began to change. The environment ceased to be a sacred companion and became a resource to be exploited. The first cities brought with them organization, but also inequality. Food was no longer shared equitably. Surpluses appeared, and with them, greed. Where there was once cooperation, domination emerged. Social hierarchies became more rigid, with elites controlling the land, crops, and knowledge. War was no longer just territorial defense, it also became a means to conquer resources, impose beliefs, and expand empires. Violence was institutionalized. Humanity entered a new, complex, and contradictory era, where brilliant advances coexisted with unthinkable horrors. However, even in the midst of that transformation, the prehistoric heritage was still present in the ways of building, in household utensils, in seasonal celebrations, in medicinal practices based on herbs, and above all, in the values transmitted from generation to generation: solidarity, courage, the search for meaning. Today, looking back, we may feel distant from that world. Surrounded by technology, urbanism, and digital noise, it is hard to imagine a life without electricity, without the internet, without clocks. But it is enough to look into the eyes of a child exploring the forest or a mother protecting her young to understand that, in essence, we are still the same. Humanity has changed its tools, but not its essence. We still seek security, love, belonging. We still ask questions. Where do we come from? What awaits us after death? Why does pain exist? Questions that were already on the minds of our ancestors as they contemplated the stars from the entrance of their caves. Perhaps that is why archaeological findings fascinate us so much. It is not just historical curiosity, it is a deep need to reconnect with our roots. Each fossil, each cave painting, each ancient tomb reminds us that we are not alone in time, that thousands of generations preceded us, and that their blood runs through our veins. We are not the first, and we will not be the last. The history we have covered so far is one of constant adaptation, of discovery, of reinvention. But we have not yet reached the end. The final step is missing: to understand how all that past built not only our body and culture, but also our collective soul. Because what is truly amazing is not that we survived, but that we knew how, even in the deepest darkness, to dream of the light. And that light guides us to the conclusion of this journey. As the centuries passed, humanity left behind the caves, the extreme climates, and the constant threat of extinction. But in that apparent evolution towards security, something deeper began to change. Life was no longer just a struggle for physical survival, but also for the survival of the soul, of meaning, of connection with what we once were. The first settlements, with their stone and mud tools, gave way to villages and then to cities.
Roads, markets, and laws appeared. Temples, armies, and scribes emerged. The world began to fill with symbols, with structures that organized existence. History was finally beginning to be written. But what we call official history only captures a fragment of what we truly are. Prehistory did not disappear. It lives within us. It is in the reflexes that save us, in the ancestral fears we feel in the darkness, in the need to belong to a group, in the instinctive desire to protect those we love. We are civilized on the surface, but profoundly ancient in essence. Every technological advance has been an extension of an ancient instinct. The spear became a rifle. The fire became electricity. The cave became a skyscraper. But the impulses that originated them are still the same. To defend ourselves, to take shelter, to seek clarity in the midst of chaos. And above all, to keep moving forward. Today, in a world where millions live in large cities, where artificial intelligence predicts our movements, and where we can observe distant galaxies from the palm of our hand, we still face questions that our ancestors also asked themselves by the fire. Who am I? Why do I exist? What is the meaning of suffering? Is there something beyond death? Those questions have persisted not because we haven't advanced, but because they are the very engine of advancement.
Every discovery, every revolutionary idea, every poem, every prayer is born from the same deep need to understand the inexplicable. What our ancestors knew, and what we sometimes forget today, is that the answer is not always outside. It is not always in the stars or in the numbers, but in the way we feel, how we coexist, how we face pain and love. True wisdom is not measured in bits, but in the ability to live in harmony with what surrounds us. And it is here that prehistory offers us its most powerful lesson. Life is not just about conquering, but about caring. The ancient peoples, by depending directly on nature, understood the fragility of the balance. They could not afford to forget that water, fire, earth, and air were their true allies. Arrogance meant death, humility survival. That is why today, on a planet facing climate crises, loss of biodiversity, and emotional disconnection, looking to the past is not empty nostalgia. It is a guide, a warning, a mirror. We must recover that ancestral consciousness. It is not about returning to the caves or renouncing advances. It is about integrating the wisdom of the past with the intelligence of the present. To listen to the river again before polluting it. To thank the sun again for giving us life. To gather again around the fire, physical or symbolic. To share stories, fears, and hopes. Because every time we light a candle in the middle of the darkness, every time we look at a child with tenderness, every time we feel awe before a starry night, we are remembering something that dwells in the deepest part of our genetic memory. We were, are, and will be part of something much larger. And that something is not limited to the human being. For millions of years, we shared the planet with colossal creatures, with species that developed amazing hunting strategies, with ecological networks of incredible precision. From marine trilobites to woolly mammoths, every living being that existed before us left its mark on the earth and in us. The extinction of those species also speaks to us. It tells us that life is precious but fragile, that the balance can be broken, that we are powerful
but not invincible. The meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs, the glaciation that extinguished many species, the droughts and earthquakes that forced entire tribes to migrate, all of that is part of a dance of survival in which we still participate today. We now have the opportunity to write the next chapter of that history with consciousness. We can be destroyers or guardians. We can live as if we were the owners of the planet, or as if we are its grateful children. That is the choice before us. And understanding how our ancestors lived 300,000 years ago may be the key to making the right decision. Because if they, with so little, were able to adapt, resist, and create meaning, what could we not do with all that we have? Evolution is not only biological, it is also spiritual. It is the ability to learn from our mistakes, to care for others, to look beyond oneself. In that sense, every act of compassion, every gesture of respect for life, is a victory over barbarism. Thus ends this journey into the depths of our history, a journey that has not been to the past, but to the interior, to that place where the echoes of the first fire, the whispers of the first story told, the emotion of the first dawn still live. Our ancestors were not soulless savages. They were wise in another way, masters of adaptation, poets of silence, survivors of oblivion. And by remembering them, we not only honor them, we reconnect with what we really are.